I'm Jenna Carroll, and I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society of Cheshire County. Museums across the country have been thinking about how we're going to commemorate the 250th anniversary of American independence. Beyond the Battlefield is the name of our exhibition. We are looking at the experiences of 14 unique individuals who lived around Southwest New Hampshire and how they were impacted by events leading up to the American Revolution or participated in it. The Historical Society did research for quite a few years. We had a team of volunteers over the years that have been helping us. We started gathering all these really interesting stories. It starts with this initial question, and for us the question was, how many people signed the association test and how many people didn't? What percentage of people in our region supported the cause initially?
I am Alan Rumrill, the Senior Historian at the Historical Society of Cheshire County. The association test was something that New Hampshire government put in place, and most of the colonies did, at the request of the Continental Congress at that time. And if you signed that, you were known to be a patriot and supporting the cause. If you didn't, you were suspected of being a loyalist. So there were quite a few people who did not sign the test.
We've been researching a number of the men that signed the association test and that actually went with Wyman when he left after Lexington and Concord. I'm Becky Barton. I am a volunteer. We each took a couple of towns in the county. So I took Keene because I've done extensive research on Keene already, and I was familiar with some of the people.
I think that this area was more of a patriotic and revolutionary group of citizens. We were far from the coast where the colonial government had been headquartered. Many New Hampshire men were militiamen, which meant that they served for short periods. They were farmers who went away to fight for a few months or for one specific engagement.
So we needed to defend ourselves. Great Britain is across the ocean. They're not going to get here in time. So we always had militiamen in each province. They had someone in charge of the militia. They would drill. They had rifles. Each province had to supply gunpowder and bullets to the militiamen so they could protect their outposts, their towns if needed.
The state was very involved in the military, with many, many New Hampshire troops going to fight at Lexington and Concord.
They dropped everything. They went before the Continental Army was established towards the Cambridge-Lexington area to help them. Isaac Wyman was a man of middling means who fought in the French and Indian War. He was from Woburn, Massachusetts, and he eventually came here and settled in Keene about 1761 when the French and Indian War was over. Wyman had experience from Fort Massachusetts being in charge of men, and when they heard about Lexington and Concord, he was asked if he would lead the men who wanted to go.
But they could only stay for a few weeks, and then they would have to get home to care for their families. They had to work on the farm to survive. Most of these people were subsistence farmers, so they had to be successful on their farms.
The Continental Army were men that signed up for usually a longer period of time, 3 years, had more extensive training. We were more organized then, so we could offer them uniforms.
Many men did join the Continental Army as well and served under General Washington.
So my name's Emilia Whippie Prior, and I am a 5th grade teacher, and I'm also a volunteer here at the Historical Society. I am an 18th century reenactor. During the Revolution, there was a lot more added, actually, to women's roles, because when the men went off to fight, the women were at home and now had to take care of all the things they normally had to take care of, in addition to maybe taking on some of those roles that men left.
Prices went up during the war because a lot of the food was going to the army and a lot of the supplies and money was devalued. So it was very difficult for people on the home front. They wanted to support the cause, but it became more and more difficult.
From what scholars can tell, the majority of people were kind of in the middle. I'm Greg Knouff. I'm the professor and chair of history at Keene State College. Progressively, as the war began and the revolution went on, it became more of an either-or, which was primarily pushed by the revolutionaries.
So there was a New Hampshire Committee of Safety which oversaw the government at the time the war began in the early years of the Revolutionary War, but each town could appoint its own committee of safety to be sure that the townspeople were supporting the revolutionary cause. So they watched very closely if anyone was known to be a loyalist or suspected of being a loyalist.
They generally took a very proactive stance that you had to declare an oath of allegiance or take the test oath in order to demonstrate that you were supportive of the revolution.
It says, "We are to show our determination in joining our American brethren in defending the lives, liberties, and properties of the inhabitants of the United Colonies," which we refer to ourselves as. "We, the subscribers, the men that sign their name, do hereby solemnly engage and promise that we will, to the utmost of our power, at the risk of our lives and fortunes, with arms, oppose the hostile proceedings of the British fleets and armies against the United American Colonies." So they're asking them to make a pretty solid commitment. Not everyone was called to make that commitment.
The people who refused to sign it were people who had real loyalty to the British Empire, or also were concerned about the implications of doing it, about being accused of treason. This is something that they just, in principle, did not want to do. Breed Batchelor was somebody who absolutely refused to take that oath.
He was involved in the politics in the town. He was really a leader politically. By 1763, he had purchased more than 2,000 acres of land in Packersfield, New Hampshire, which is now the town of Nelson. And he married Ruth Davis, and they lived in Nelson by the next year when their first child was born. But when the Revolutionary War started, he supported the king and the government of England as a loyalist.
There were people who were more adamant about that, and those were the people who tended to get driven out of the community.
He wasn't very nice to the Committee of Safety. He said that they could not come into his house, but they could stand in his yard and talk with his pigs. He was the only person in the town of Packersfield who did not sign the association test in support of the Revolutionary War, and then he refused to serve in the military for the revolutionary cause. He realized that he was probably in danger at that point, as his neighbors were very upset with him, so he went to a cave in the town of Packersfield, and he stayed there for about 3 months, living in a cave not too far from his house. His wife would bring him food and drink so that he could survive in the cave.
What she was doing the whole time was keeping the family together and keeping the economic viability of the household going. Batchelor eventually left
and never returned to the town of Nelson again. He joined the British Army, Burgoyne's British Army, and was at the Battle of Bennington in 1777, fighting for the British against the revolutionary troops.
We had quite a few troops from different towns that participated in Bennington. Bennington is relatively close, so it was not a long march.
Many of the men at the Battle of Bennington were New Hampshire men. When the British tried to divide New England from the rest of the colonies, General Burgoyne brought his army of about 7,500 men from Canada down the Hudson River Valley. So General John Stark gathered 1,500 New Hampshire militiamen in a matter of 6 days and marched toward Bennington. By a few weeks later, he had control of 2,000 men there at Bennington, Vermont. 252 of those soldiers were residents of what is now Cheshire County, so more than 10% of his army. And one of his neighbors, Richard Farwell, from the town of Nelson, recognized Batchelor across the battlefield and shot him. Farwell told his neighbors, he said, "Oh, I've killed Batchelor," but he had wounded him in the shoulder. They slowed down the British Army for other troops to get in place ahead of it. Soon after, 2 battles of Saratoga were fought, and General Burgoyne surrendered his entire army of more than 6,000 men that he had left with him at that time. So after the Battle of Saratoga, Batchelor was sent to Canada with other wounded British troops and could no longer fight for the British Army and died within a few years. His wife was back here in Nelson or Packersfield with the children, and the government had confiscated all of his land because he was a loyalist.
She remained in Nelson and then eventually petitioned the New Hampshire government to get a portion of the estate back. And in her petition, she made the argument that this was a decision my husband made, I didn't make it.
And they allowed the family to remain on the farm, but they had to pay rent to live in their own house. And it remained that way for many years, and finally, several years after the war and after Mr. Batchelor's death, his wife was given the farm and a small amount of property back so that she and her children could support themselves.
So under the law, women had no independent will, but in reality, in some of the cases that played out in terms of confiscation, women could begin to make an argument that I've stayed here to protect the family, that I should get some portion of the estate. She made the conscious decision to remain in New Hampshire, and what she was doing the whole time was trying to save as much as she could of the family's estate for the children. The assumption was that women couldn't have political opinions of their own. Indeed, they did. They had all kinds of subtle notions of what the revolution meant. They expressed support and different levels of opposition towards it. The oaths were not required of women, and that's because of the British common law tradition of coverture for married women. The expectation was a woman was covered by her husband, so her husband's actions would be what the family was responsible for. But it did, during the Revolution, raise a lot of gray areas. In the case of the Batchelors is a good case.
Coverture was based on the assumption that a family functioned best if the male head of the household controlled all of its assets. When a woman got married, she lost a lot of her own kind of personal rights. She still had legal rights, but not that autonomy that she had if she was unmarried or if she was a widow. Unmarried women, including widows, were called femme soles, or women alone. And they had the legal right to live where they pleased and to have an occupation. Single women could enter into contracts and they could buy and sell real estate, accumulate personal property. A married woman could not own property independently of her husband unless they had signed a special contract called a marriage settlement. You know, thinking in Keene, when I was reading Abner Sanger's diary, even just the way he speaks about different women is really curious. He has an older sister whose first name is Rhoda, and he refers to Rhoda all the time. Rhoda was unmarried. His younger sister, Mary, married a man named Jeremiah Stiles. When Abner Sanger writes about his sister, he refers to her as Jeremiah Stiles' wife, even though it's his sister. So that difference in how a man of the time was referring to two different sisters based on their marital status, I think is really curious. I think there's a lot of misconceptions, and I think that we are still uncovering those misconceptions. How were women participating in the war? Camp followers or sutlers, women who sold goods to the soldiers, the folks who did laundry services for the army. So there were a lot of women who were participating. So that's, I think, an interesting misconception that people are bringing to light more and more today. I was reading a fact about like 300 women were following one particular army. Thinking of women as only being at home and not having a voice is not reality. I think that's one thing that I love, like finding new information, and I like when we can pull out some of those myths and kind of bust them.
Yeah, so my name's Cassidy Loft. I'm currently a second-year master's student at Northeastern University, pursuing a master's in history, concentration in public history, and getting a certificate in digital humanities. So I decided to reach out to both the Historical Society of Cheshire County and the Monadnock Cultural Center of History and see if there was anything that I could provide my help with. So what we landed on was creating a project revolving around the 250th, as it's a very timely event, and looking at those Black patriots of the Revolutionary War from the Monadnock region. People tend to forget how large of a presence slavery was and Black individuals were in the New England area. And their role in the revolution is often forgotten or pushed to the side, very marginalized. So we really wanted to bring that kind of forward during this time.
At the time of the revolution, there were slaves owned in the colony of New Hampshire, hundreds of slaves, as there were in most of the colonies. Slavery was not as successful or widespread in the North. There were not huge crops of cotton and sugarcane here as there were in the South. But there still were slaves in New Hampshire, and after the war there were slaves in New Hampshire.
A lot of my research is also understanding that we might not have specifics due to uneven sourcing, especially when it came to these Black individuals. I have found 21 soldiers that fought in the Revolutionary War from the Monadnock region. We even had some people at Lexington and Concord, which is really, really fascinating. Like, they were there from the very beginning. They were in Sullivan's expedition. They were in New York. They were all over, and it was really interesting. They were at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Like, they were at almost any major event, such as Silas Berdeau. He was one of the individuals in Lexington and Concord. He was free, and his family actually had a history of being a military family. But there were a lot of individuals that were also enslaved and got their freedom through their enlistment and through fighting. They were granted their freedom for their participation.
There were many, thousands and thousands of Black soldiers during the war, and they fought on both sides. The British attracted Black soldiers by telling them that they would earn their freedom when the war ended. The revolutionaries, the colonists, would not allow Black soldiers for some time after the war began because their owners were afraid that they would escape. Eventually, General Washington and the other generals accepted Black soldiers because they needed more soldiers. Some of the Black soldiers were freed and some simply were not. But they were free Black men who signed up to fight in the Revolution as well, and they were often given some land or pay. Numerous of those men, those Black men who had fought, who came and settled in the Monadnock region after the war ended.
Definitely came across Woodward quite a bit, and that is one of the individuals that we have a little bit more information on. So it was really interesting to see him in things like the Battle of Bennington. But we also have record of his story first having a little bit of an unconventional role as he was taken as a waiter for Captain Edward Raymond. We have documentation of that, and then he was later appointed as wagon master. I think that one of the main things that I want people to come away with is just a better understanding of just how involved these Black individuals were in the Revolutionary War. They were really a part of this big, broader scheme of creating our nation, and really that intertwinement of them fighting for a freedom that they were not necessarily guaranteed or exactly welcomed in the formation of the country, but they were very much a part of it.
I think that idea of beyond the battlefield, I think, is a really impactful component because war impacted everybody, everywhere. There was so much going on and so many stories outside of those battles that I think have maybe not been highlighted as much. I think we hear about the battles, we hear about the soldiers, we hear about Washington and some of these great men, but thinking about all of the other people whose stories haven't been told, that's always something that I like to talk to my students about when we're doing historical writing, is whose story will you tell? And I think there's a lot of stories out there still left to tell, and a lot of those are beyond the battlefield.
The battle is only one component of a war. It's how did you get there? How did you survive? Who took care of the wounded? How did you get back home? It's hard to know because a lot of information doesn't make it down to present day.
It's like any war of nationalism or independence against a colonial power. There's a lot of desire to have a simplistic story of patriots versus loyalists when it is way more complicated than that. That image of a few loyalists and mostly patriots kind of came out of the end of the American Revolution. One of the interesting things is the loyalists that were reintegrated into the community, they embraced that story to try to erase their past. And typically what they would do is focus on certain well-known, infamous Loyalists. I think that's why in this region, Breen Batchelor is remembered, because he was so adamant about his opposition to the revolution.
Inevitably, as we do this research, we were dispelling myths that some of us carried with us. I think it's important to look beyond just the battles, to provide some deeper meaning and context to what we thought we all learned in school. I think for us, where we focus on 14 different individuals, helps provide a sense of place and feel more rooted or connected to the community that we're a part of today.